Hi, I'm Preston Williams, and welcome to another edition of Jazz Talk. Today on our show, we are joined by one of the most accomplished jazz musicians in this music today. This gentleman has been on the scene for almost 60 years and has worked with many greats from Blood, Sweat, and Tears to Horace Silver, Art Blakey, so many, Parliament Funkadelic, his own brother Michael Brecker, Stevie Wonder, Shaka Khan, and Jaco Pastorius, to name a few. He is a seven-time Grammy Award-winning trumpeter and composer. Please welcome to Jazz Talk the legendary Mr. Randy Brecker. How are you, sir?
Well, so far so good.
Man, you're looking good as always. Thanks so
Thank
much for
you.
being on Jazz Talk today. You're one of my musical heroes. And recently I did see you, I guess maybe a couple of months ago at Keystone Corner
Right,
with an incredible band with Mike Stern and Dennis Chambers. And
right.
that was really special. I really enjoyed that. It's good to see you. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about your humble beginnings. And I understand that you're from Pennsylvania. What is that place called? Is it Chattelham or something like that?
Cheltenham Township, Elkins Park to be specific, within the township. It's and then we moved to Melrose Park, still in the same township, but basically Philly. We were a block out of the Philadelphia city limits. So
Interesting.
if you cross the street, you'd be in the Philly in actual North Philadelphia.
Yeah. I have a niece that currently lives there. So when I was doing some research on where you're from, I said, "Oh gosh, my niece lives there." So yeah, that's quite interesting. One of the things that I found fascinating about your background is your mom and dad, especially your dad, being a an attorney, but also a pianist himself, as you referred to him as semi-pro. And I guess that had an influence on you guys, you and your brother, as far as jazz, because I guess he would play jazz records in the house, with Miles, Dizzy, Clifford Brown, and those guys.
Right.
And tell me a little bit about that. I mean, was he really a good pianist, Randy?
Oh yeah, he was great. In fact, on a record called "Into the Sun," I actually utilized one of his tracks on the record, and I wrote kind of a suite around it. When I was 2 weeks old, he kind of forecast the future and wrote a tune for me. And
Mm,
in the tune, it prefaced that the first line was something like, "I'll be so proud of you, honey, when I hear you give out on that horn." And the
yeah.
preface that I'll play drums, maybe a hot fife, and love music even more than my wife. So my future was foretold. He was great. He was a great player, great singer, songwriter. Probably could have done it uh, as a living, I think, but he was, from a poor family and was wanted to have a more substantial form of making a living, and became an attorney. But he played throughout his life, many jam sessions at our house with really good players.
Yeah,
So I just grew up with everything.
that's awesome. And I guess you started playing what right around the time you were 8, because I guess you chose between the trumpet or the what clarinet, so you chose trumpet.
Yeah.
Would you
Well,
say
what
would you say I guess those two were the only thing that were available, but you think the trumpet had more of an effect on you? Because like you said, if he's playing Dizzy, Miles, Clifford, and his guys in the house, and he loves those guys, I'm surely that must have had a profound effect on you. Like, I really like the sound of this horn. Maybe I should try trumpet, because I can't see you playing a clarinet, you know?
Yeah, well, I like to say my younger brother got stuck with the clarinet,
Yeah.
as he put it, because he didn't want to play the same instrument. And like I said, we were officially in the suburbs, so it was a suburban school. They didn't have much of a music program, and you correctly mentioned that they only had, at least during our years, trumpets or clarinets available for study. Dad loved trumpet. He just loved trumpet players, partially because Clifford Brown was alive and well until I was about 10 years old
Yeah.
and lived in Philadelphia. They were playing all the time, so he was the talk of the town. And also there was another fine young trumpet player named Bobby Mojica,
Hmm.
who sadly just passed away relatively recently. He had a good career, also had another business, but in Detroit, wonderful player, and he came over and played all the time. So I actually got to hear a real good trumpet player
Wow.
uh, on weekends, and we connected years later. He came up. I was playing with somebody in Detroit and said, "Hey, I'm Bobby Mohican." Of course, I remembered him, and he had a very good career in Detroit as a trumpet player and a business on the side.
Mm.
So I just grew up with the music. I remember Dad listening to Clifford on one of the records, and I was sitting there, and he actually grabbed me by my whatever I was wearing and said, "Randy, trumpet's the greatest jazz instrument." He was overcome with emotion. And so it was a natural thing. I kind of had, I remember having my eyes kind of set because it looked like more fun on trombones, but they didn't have one.
Yeah, yeah. That's
And
awesome. Also, I was going to say that must have been incredible for you guys as youngsters. Your dad taking you to see people like Miles,
oh,
and Duke
sure.
Ellington and people like that, Thelonious Monk. I'm like, wow, I would have been blown away. I guess when you guys were really young, I don't think you and Michael really realized like these guys that I'm seeing. I mean, these are like the cream of the crop. These are the masters. I mean, the great, probably the three of the greatest musicians of all time. I mean, seeing Thelonious Monk, I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Wow.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Yeah, I mean, can you remember those really well, Randy?
yeah, oh, yeah, sure. I appreciated their greatness even at that age. When I was 8 years old, I was a hip kid in that respect. I remember, I've told this story. We had music class once a week, and the teacher, to get out of kind of teaching, appointed every week somebody to bring in their favorite record. 8 years old, and this was the beginnings of Elvis and rock and roll, early
Right.
50s. And at 8 years old, I brought in John Hendricks singing Cloudburst,
Oh,
and
wow.
I could sing the thing from beginning to end almost. I still can remember a lot of it.
Yeah.
So I kind of knew what was going on, and strangely enough, because he became so great, Mike got interested later. Really, he had other things going for him. He loved sports more than I did. So he loved basketball. He was kind of into science. He had a chemistry set, so he was always in the basement experimenting with that. And the music didn't really catch on with him till maybe it was because of the clarinet too, because he studied that for 5 or 6 years before he discovered Cannonball and then Coltrane, of course. Then the rest was history.
Yeah.
But I don't recall him going to the early clubs. Well, it was a 3-year age difference, and Dad kind of took me under his wing, and we would just go, the two of us, quite often to a place called the Red Hill Inn
Yeah.
in Red Hill, New Jersey, which was advertised quite a bit on the local jazz station, and they had all the great groups, and we'd sit in the front row, and I'd hear all these great people, Miles Monk, Carmen McRae, Maynard's big band. That was a thrill, sitting in front of that band. That was amazing. And I didn't take it for granted, though. I know these guys were special.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, you're growing up, you eventually go to school and, you're honing your skills. Now, was it in college? Or I guess sometime in the 60s, did you get a chance to work with Thad Jones and Mel Lewis?
Well, that was after college, and it
Okay.
came when I moved to New York. Uh, I was very lucky in the fact that well, let me preface it by saying I went to Indiana University stage band camp. I saw it advertised in Downbeat when I was 15.
Hmm.
Stan Kenton Band Camp, actually, it was called. And I took a bus out there. It was a 2-week engagement or campsite, so to speak. It kind of moved around from different schools, but this particular one was 2 weeks, and Stan's whole band was there.
Yeah.
And Cannonball Adderley Sextet were special guests the second week. People like Donald Byrd was there both weeks. I got to play in the headband because I was 15, but I could improvise pretty fluently. I didn't know what I was doing exactly, but
Yeah.
there were other young students there my age, like Dave Sanborn, Lou Marini, Keith Jarrett was there, although he didn't talk to anybody, so none of us recalled meeting him. Uh, I always leave this out. Peter Erskine was there, but he was only 7,
Oh,
and he played his ass off. I mean,
he's
he could
great.
already play. And Don Grolnick,
Yep. The late
a
Don
good,
Grolnick. Yeah.
yeah, the late Don Grolnick, a good friend of mine, Mitch Farber, who I worked for quite a bit, wonderful pianist and writer. I worked for him a lot in New York. So that 2 week period was a big influence. I said, man, this is really what I have to do. Marvin Stamm was my big band director, and John Laporta was the head of the what they called the head band, where we would jam up arrangements. This band was specifically improvisers, and I remember him asking me after the rehearsal, man, young man, what kind of scales are those? And I went, I don't know. I had no idea what I was doing yet. But we had a band, Sanborn and I and Marini. In fact, Marini and Sanborn were roommates. And we all stayed in touch after that. And I decided to go to Indiana to study music. They had a wonderful music school with a big endowment. It was brand new, all the best modern equipment, getting all famous teachers from all over the world. I studied with Bill Adam there, who went on to teach so many great players, Jerry Hay, Chris Bodie, Charlie Davis. He was a very well-known trumpet teacher. But the school big band was also wonderful. First led by Buddy Baker, and then led by Jerry Coker. And David Baker was on the scene. A lot of guys from the Indianapolis were playing with George Russell, guys that you probably know. And Indianapolis had a really great jazz history, particularly trumpet players, Freddie Hubbard being from there, Slide Hampton, JJ. So we had a particularly good big band. This will be a long story, but it'll get to your question.
Fine. Please share.
In 1965, the band was especially good, and we won the Notre Dame Jazz Festival. And one of the perks, so to speak, we were offered a 4-month tour of the Middle East and Asia by the U.S. State Department, which we readily took. So we left in, I believe it was February of 1966, and toured all over for 4 months. Fascinating trip. I mean, I could just talk about that for the whole hour, to hear all music from India, Pakistan, all the Arab countries, Sri Lanka, and literally over 16 weeks. And by happenstance, I'll cut to this. We noticed again in Downbeat that in Vienna, towards the end of our trip, in fact, kind of coincided with the end of our trip, was the first international jazz competition in Vienna.
Oh, wow.
And so several of us, there was also the IU Jazz Sextet, the improvisers in the big band. We went to, I remember our last gig was in Athens, Greece. So we made it from Athens to Vienna to this competition. And we were there between a week and 10 days. There were hundreds of kids there. And they had semifinals, then semifinals, then finals. So you were around everybody for a length of time. And among some of the other students, so to speak, were people like, and everyone was a student. Nobody was well known yet, except two guys. Eddie Daniels was there. He was already in New York, wonderful tenor saxophonist. And Franco Ambrosetti was there, who was about 5 years older than I was. But everyone else generally were teenagers. The young Miroslav Vitus, George Mraz. This is where we all met. Franco, Eddie, Tomasz Stajko, wonderful Polish trumpet player who just passed away. Claudio Roditi, Jigs Wiggum, the young Jan Hammer, of course, went on to do the music for Miami Vice and Mahavishnu. I'm leaving out a lot of names. There were so many people, but we all stayed in touch after that. We became close, and a lot of people moved to New York after that. And the judges on that festival were just incredible. It was Cannonball Adderley, J.J. Johnson, Mel Lewis, Ron Carter, Joe Zawinul, and Art Farmer. Those are the judges we had to play in front of. So to make a long story short, when I decided to move to New York and go to NYU, Mel called and asked me to join the band. They had an opening not long after I moved to New York. And people like Ron Carter had some gigs for me. It was fascinating. And all basically to those competitions. At the Notre Dame Jazz Festival, I won a trumpet prize, and Clark Terry gave me the award. He was a judge at that, and he asked me to join the band when he started a big band in New York. He called up. I couldn't believe it was his voice on the phone. And my teacher at the Stan Kenton band camp, Marvin Sam, was also new in town, so he joined Clark's band. It's all fascinating to me how it was all so connected to things I had done. And I had an easy time of it because I had met all these great musicians. Miroslav came to New York shortly after me. George Miraz went to Berkeley for a couple of years, as did Jan Hammer, but they made their way to New York and became the busiest guys in town. And we all helped each other, make a long story short. So I had a pretty easy time of it. It was a different world back then.
That's incredible, man. Wow, what a story. Now, Randy, how did you get involved with Blood, Sweat, and Tears?
Well,
You're on
that
the
came,
very first recording.
yeah. Another kind of happenstance. One of the things that I remember doing was Juilliard had a pretty good big band there. They didn't have a jazz program yet. Many of the schools didn't, but they had a big band that rehearsed pretty regularly at the school. And someone asked me, his name was Jerry Weiss, a trumpet player who was going to Juilliard, asked me to come up and play a few times because they were short a trumpet player. Lo and behold, he became part of the original Blood, Sweat, and Tears. They had the band all set up already, but one of the guys who was the school teacher, also a high school band director, was afraid of that whole scene going away on the road. So they had a trumpet opening, and I was literally the last. Jerry called, or one of the guys called, and asked if I'd be interested in joining the band. And I was interested in other styles of music. I thought it would be a good learning experience. They were all good musicians in the band. Fred Lipsius was a pretty well-known arranger and alto player around New York who had done the charts. So I said, sure, let's try it. And I stayed with them for about a year and did that first record, Child is Father to the Man, from which I learned a whole bunch, just seeing how those kind of records were made. It was different than just going in the studio with a quintet and counting the tunes off and play, and then you leave 6 hours later. This took several weeks to record, and I learned how you build a record like that from the bottom up. So it was a great experience.
Yeah, and then right after that, you went on and played with the great Horace Silver.
That's right.
Yeah, and one of my favorites.
Well, that was a dream come true, you know. Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I'll never forget this, and I've told this many times, but it's always a good story. Had a band meeting, and Horace had called and had asked me to join the band. So I was kind of in a spot. The core of the Blood, Sweat, and Tears was the rhythm section. The horn players, other than Freddie, we were kind of hired guns. We were on salary. We weren't really part of the nucleus yet. So they had gotten together and decided that, it's funny, I was just thinking about him earlier. I saw him interviewed earlier. The great Al Cooper wasn't quite a strong enough lead singer after we had done the record. So they had found another singer in Canada named David Clayton Thomas, and they were announced at this meeting that they were going to hire David Clayton Thomas in addition to Al doing the singing. Al got up, didn't like the idea, and said, I quit, basically. And he walked out of the room. And I thought, well, this is a good time to bring up that I think I'm leaving the band too, because Horace had called. And I love you guys, but I just don't get to improvise enough, which was true. It was basically a horn section. I'd play maybe one or two improvised solos a night. And they begged me, you know, they were good friends. They wanted me to stay. They offered to cut me in equally. They were going to make the horn section an equal part of the band, blah, blah, blah. Next day, I was at a Joe Henderson big band rehearsal, and I had really stuck to my guns. I say, look, I think I'm going to leave. And my good friend Lou Soloff was sitting next to me. I asked him, look, man, I'm in a spot. You want to join Blood, Sweat, and Tears? It's $100 a week, whether you work or not. It's a salary. It's two $50 gigs you don't have to do. And by the end, he didn't want to do it at first, but by the end of the rehearsal, I had him talked into it. I went on my way with Horace. He went off with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. They hired David Clayton Thomas and recorded their second record, which in turn sold 11 million copies, had 3 hits, became record of the year.
Yeah.
You know, Spinning Wheel and When I Die and You Make Me So Very Happy, one of the biggest selling records of all time. And to make a long story short, their salary went up like 5,000%, you know.
Right after you left,
Yeah.
right?
And they were making, I think, 5,000 a week after a few weeks after it
Wow.
really hit, and playing Las Vegas, Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
Of course, I was having a great time with Horace, with Billy Cobham on drums, Benny Maupin on tenor saxophone, John B. Williams on bass. But I was only making $250 a week, which I thought at first would be a raise from $100 a week. But Horace took taxes out, so that left $147.50, and we had to pay for our hotels. He left that out of the deal. So at the end of the week, it was, okay, Benny, you owe me $50. Randy, you owe me $70. But that was just a great. I was with that band. We were close to 2 years till Horace broke up the band. He wanted to move to California, and playing with those guys. Yeah, I for a short period of time, for several months, went on to Art Blakey. I think Woody recommended me to that gig, and that was also great. We played at the East Side Club Slugs quite a bit. Yeah, but different people in the band. It wasn't a particularly great time for Buhena, but it was just great to play with them. We toured up and down the East Coast mostly.
Yeah. Randy, I was going to ask you, working with earlier in your career, working with giants such as Horace Silver and Art Blakey, what do you think you learned most from working with two guys like that early in your career? I guess, going forward, having that under your belt, did it sort of help you in a sense in your career, knowing, I guess, what a band looks like, how a band is run? You're looking at the leader and saying, oh man, I'm picking up and I'm learning some things from him, how a band is really supposed to work, especially a jazz group. What do you think you learned most from working with those guys?
Yeah, well, you kind of answered the question. I learned how to impersonate a band leader from them, and they were seasoned veterans at that, and different in their own way. Yeah. But they gave the sidemen a certain amount of leeway. Art more than Horace. Horace was more specific in what he wanted on certain tunes. Mm-hmm. But it's an art unto itself, and I think out of everything, that's mostly what I learned. But also how to shape a solo, just how to play. Man, I was playing maybe not every night because we worked quite a bit, but not as much as Horace or as Art would have liked. But we were playing quite a bit, and that's when you could go to a club and stay. That was when it really got fun, when you go to Ronnie Scott's and play there for a month. That just doesn't happen anymore. Play every night or 6 nights a week for a month. Really get your chops up, your creativity. Learn what it was like to play the same tunes every night, but kind of build on what you were improvising. So it was just really a growth period for me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, I guess somewhere in that time period, I guess it was 1969, you did your first recording, Score. Tell me about that, and what were you trying to say on that record? That was your debut.
Yeah.
The world is being introduced to Randy Brecker. Tell me about that recording and what that was like for you, recording that and just the musicians on it, because I guess you had your brother, Michael, on there, a young Michael Brecker.
Yeah.
Was on, I guess, he wasn't even 20 years old yet then, was he?
Yeah, he was 19, and I think I've got my, I'm a little more accurately, he had just moved to New York. He also went to Indiana University, kind of had the same background, started a band there with Randy Sankey, a wonderful trumpet player, but people confuse sometimes the two. And this will be another kind of long answer. That they were most infamous for being disqualified from the Notre Dame Jazz Festival that year because they played jazz rock. The judges, I think among them were Oliver Nelson, maybe Ray Brown. They got disqualified. They played jazz rock. The judges didn't want to hear that. And they were far away, of course, the best band. Mm-hmm. So, and Mike ended up moving to New York, and I think that was one of his first gigs. I was also playing with great Duke Pearson big band, with a lot of big bands happening. And Duke also was a producer and A&R man at I guess the parent company was United Artists, but it was basically Blue Note Solid State. It was the same office. And he asked me to, he saw, I guess, some dollar signs. I was young and I had a kind of a background in jazz and jazz rock, which was it was on the scene at the time. So that's what I tried to present. Not only a straight ahead jazz record, we did some, but I was a big fan of a lot of people in the rock scene, or even the rocky folk scene, Donovan, and I was a fan of those kind of tunes. And I wrote some of my first original tunes with that in mind, and hired different people for different things on that record. Larry Coryell, who I had met in Seattle, played, and also Hal Galper, Mickey Roker, Eddie Gomez on some tracks also, and Duke Pearson. Had never heard of these guys, but I had been doing a lot of sessions with the great Bernard Pretty Purdy and Chuck Rainey. So they came on two or three or four tunes that Hal Galper, who I had gotten associated with through gigs, had written too. So the record, I was my first experience, but under the circumstance, and having Mike there, who was a uncut diamond at the time, it was interesting. It came out pretty well, I think, under the circumstances. Got good reviews, and people enjoyed it. I was scared, beyond belief to do. We did the whole thing, and actually there wasn't much of a budget. So if I'm not wrong, we did all the recording in one day, 2 sessions, and maybe a couple of mixing sessions. And like I said, Duke was taken aback because I had these guys he'd never heard of, but he learned quickly that it's another style of music, but those guys can play.
Yeah, a good debut. Now, you're also in the group Dreams, a short-lived group. You guys were, I think, only together. You only made, 2 recordings? Group lasted a year or 2 or something like that?
Yeah, sadly, only 2 recordings that are kind of cult favorites. Never had a big hit, but what was interesting about that band, it formed after Horace, during my period with Art Blakey, when Horace broke the band up. Billy and I, particularly Billy and I, came back to New York. I think Benny was on his way, and John B. were on their way to moving to California too, if I'm not wrong, but that might have been a few years later. But we ran into my brother somewhere. My memory was at the Vanguard, and Mike had told me that although he was new in town, he had met a trombone player named Barry Rogers, who in turn was very well known in the Latin music scene. He created the 2 trombone sound for Eddie Palmieri, as a matter of fact, really highly respected in that genre. Everybody always to this day talks about Barry Rogers, and his son Chris is a wonderful trumpet player now, who in turn had met 2 singer-songwriters, Doug Lubon and Jeff Kent, and they were looking for a drummer and a trumpet player. So, and me and Billy said, well, we're back in town, that's how the band started. And what differentiated that band from the other horn bands was the fact that we didn't write anything down. We jammed all the horn parts up. Everything just happened in rehearsals. We recorded everything. That was having the advent of cassette playing. That's how far that goes back. So we all recorded everything. Never wrote down a note, and just jammed up all the tunes. They were conducive for that. They were open kind of harmonically. And the band around New York became pretty popular. We had pretty good managers, got us gigs right away, and we became the house band at the Village Gate. Played there quite a bit for comedians and famous other great jazz musicians. A lot for comedians. Richard Pryor we opened for quite a bit, and other well-known comedians. But we got known around town as kind of a group, horn section, so that helped our studio work. Clive Davis came to hear us one night, and he loved the band, so he signed us to Columbia Records. And we recorded those years, 1970 and maybe 1971, the second record. And we changed personnel somewhat, had the young Will Lee in the band from Florida,
Yeah.
and Don
Faces
Grolnick.
Will Lee. Yeah.
Yeah. And the musically, both records were big success and had a cult following, but we never quite had a hit.
Yeah.
But we got popular enough that we started getting a lot of calls for studio work. Billy, in turn, got a call from a new guitar player in town. His name was John McLaughlin, who was starting a band called Mahavishnu.
Yeah.
And Billy jumped at that, and we had no drummer. And no one played that style yet. Billy really was the first guy to really combine jazz and rock and funk and the whole thing. There was just nobody who could play like he did. We had famous drum auditions for months, and we finally just gave up. So that was the demise of the band.
Billy Shoes, yeah.
And
Speaking of studio work, session work, Randy, when I really look at your resume, I can't think of another trumpeter who's done as much. I mean, you've worked with everybody, and it's incredible. I'm like, this guy's resume is unbelievable, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about, just the people that you've worked with over the years. I mean, for instance, what was it like, working with George Benson? Because you worked with him several times.
well, he's a great guy. In fact, we were supposed to play this week. We hadn't done it, and he's fine. He had a rotator cuff operation, so he was out of commission. We're going to do it instead in August. Open the show for him, but he was always on the scene. Great guy, and we would play. He remember once I was playing with Clark's big band up in Harlem, and George was just on his own recording stuff for his personal collection. And when we had our club, 7th Avenue South, he would come down a bit quite a bit and play. Just he wanted to play. And eventually we did some sessions. I wrote some charts for him. Just a great guy, and I haven't actually seen him in a long time. So I'm looking forward to our gig together, which is now in August. That's August beautiful. 4th, I think, for the Jazz Cruise people in St. Louis. So those of you in that area, keep an eye out for that. It's going to be well advertised.
Oh yeah. What about Frank Zappa?
Well, that was a short-lived association, but one of the most well-known records that I played on, and I still have never. I was recently in New Orleans last weekend, and somebody came up with I had to sign one of the records, and I've never really heard the thing from beginning to end. Oh, wow. But Zappa was in New York at I think it was called the Paramount Theater. I can't quite remember the theater now. It was on 14th Street. And they wanted to use the horn section from Saturday Night Live. And my good late friend, Alan Rubin, for some reason was busy or couldn't do the gig. So I was like the number 2 trumpet player those years on the show, and they needed 2 trumpets. So I got the gig, and Mike was on the gig, and Ronnie Cuber, and Lou Marini, and Tom Malone. And that lasted for a week, where we had to learn all Frank's music, long rehearsals, very serious about what he wanted. There were no, you couldn't relax for a second. But it was a great band with Terry Bozzio and Patrick O'Hearn, and the place was packed every night. And really interesting music. And what I have heard of that record is great. And that eventually led to heavy metal bebop, because Terry had some time off with Frank, and we were going on a tour, and we needed a drummer, and he fit the bill. So the next thing you know, he was on tour with us, and we eventually recorded Heavy Metal Bebop with me and Mike and Barry Finnerty and Bozzio and Neil Jason on bass. Yeah. So one thing always seemed to lead to another.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm looking at all the people that you work with. What about Stevie Wonder?
Well, that came about because my good friend at the time, Steve Medeo, who sadly just passed away a year or so ago, great trumpet player that was the regular guy with Stevie, had taken a fall and fractured his skull, sadly. He was okay, but it took several months for him to heal. So he called me to take his place, and I gladly did. It was for several months, and Sanborn was in the horn section. So, I fit in quite a bit. I had already played with him for years. Denny Morales, a very good tenor saxophonist, that was the horn section. the young, really good band. And Stevie was just so inspirational, just gave 1,000% every night, never put on a bad show, always just right on top of everything. And he worked on his music, 25 hours a day. It wasn't just that it poured, he really worked hard at it, sculpting everything.
Yeah, what a great artist. What about Steely Dan?
Well, we did the records with them. I never did a live concert with them, but they also were stern taskmasters. You had to. They were like to experiment. They like to do things over and over several times until they got probably, if you were doing a solo, every lick or every thing you knew they would get on tape. They do a 4-bar solos like 30 times. But wow, what great songs, and what great records. And sonically, they were really ahead of their time. And really, they were ahead of their time in the fact that they liked perfect rhythm. This was before the machines, so they had great musicians, but live players, and they would cut the tape up so it was exactly perfect. Everything was perfection before there were drum machines. So they were really interesting guys to work for.
Interesting. Now, Randy, I wanted to talk a little bit about a special musician. This gentleman is probably one of my all-time favorites. He's no longer with us, and I think he's the greatest. I'm talking about bassist Jaco Pastorius. You were with him early in his career when he was probably playing some of his best stuff. His very first debut record from 1976, the self-titled one. And I guess David Sanborn was on there with you too.
Yeah,
Seems like
yeah,
you and Sanborn are always doing sessions together.
yeah.
You were also on Word of Mouth and Invitation. And speaking of Invitation, your trumpet solo on that thing is just incredible. I still
Oh,
listen to that
thanks.
quite a bit, but tell me about Jaco. What was it like working with him in the early days? What was your perception of him when you first heard about him? Because I guess he was the talk of the town when he first came out. Like, who is this bass player? You know?
Yeah, well, he was the talk of New York before he even moved to New York, so that spoke volumes about his abilities. You start hearing about, man, there's this guy in Fort Lauderdale in Florida who's playing great even before he got to New York. So when we were approached to play on his first record, we jumped at the chance. We only played on really one tune, Come On, Come Over.
Right.
And he had all his Floridian crew with him, basically on that record, which we recorded at Blood, Sweat, and Tears drummer Bobby Colombi's studio.
That's right. He was the one that
Yeah,
sort of really brought Jaco out. Yeah.
yeah. And it was great playing with him. I actually took my brother's place because Jaco's band featured originally Mike and Bob Mincer, two tenors. But Mike had substance abuse problems in the early 80s, late 70s, and went into rehab and came out 1,000%, never touched anything after that. In fact, was responsible for bringing so many people, among them James Taylor, for instance, into the 12-step program. But I took Mike's place in Jaco's band and stayed, a couple of years. We toured all over the US on a bus, coast to coast. That was one of the only times I'd ever really done that. And the band got really tight on that tour. And at the time, he was still healthy. He had, as you know, serious mental issues that creeped into his life that were very tragic. But at the time, he was really enjoying himself and playing just great. And his tunes were wonderful. The band, Peter Erskine, Mincer, Othello Molyneux, sometimes Don Elias. It was just great.
It's interesting. Pat Metheny talks about Jaco. He just talked about how amazing he was in the early 70s, along with the late Hiram Bullock. And Pat says Jaco created something, that was his and his alone. He says no one even comes close. He said actually he was better then, even before he got with Weather Report. But I guess some of the musicians started seeing things in him. I guess mid 70s, early 80s, and such a shame what happened to him. And one of the things that I always let people know, and I was talking to his son Felix. Not only, I says, Felix, not only was your dad probably one of the greatest bass players of all time, but I don't know too many bass players that were great composers like him. He was also a
Oh,
brilliant composer.
oh yeah, they were great tunes, and special. He had his own harmonic and melodic concept that just was unique.
Yeah.
And I wish he had been around longer to, compose a lot more tunes. But they're all classics, and it was great to play in the small group, and also great to play tour around. We went to Japan, and also had the big band, word of mouth big band. That when we hit the larger cities, he'd put the big band together, and we'd play the big band arrangements that were. He was helped by a guy named Larry Warlow, who was the orchestrator, who didn't get much credit. Jaco used to introduce him as his copyist, but Larry also had a lot to do with those great arrangements, besides just
I still think
copying
to
them.
this day, my probably three of my favorite songs by him are John and Mary, Three Views of a Secret, and also like a Continuum.
Yeah, Continuum's great. They're all
That's
great
that's a
tunes.
great tune. Now I wanted to do I play a little game here with you. I'm going to name some trumpet players, and I want you just to say the first thing that comes to mind. A lot of these guys you know, but I'm just curious, how they've affected you, their influence on you. And I'm going to start with the very first one, Fats Navarra.
Oh, well, great sound, great technique, supreme musicality.
Yeah, I like that.
Uh,
Next name, Dizzy Gillespie.
well, the father of us all, without Dizzy, well, he was, besides his playing, I mean, the early records and even the later records where maybe his chops weren't up to what his earlier ones, he always, man, he played all the great notes. And what a composer, arranger, just all around genius. And probably his greatest gift, he was a teacher. A lot of those guys, were great players, but he could really communicate and taught everyone that came around him what was behind the theory and the whole concept behind bebop. So I can't say enough about him. It goes beyond trumpet playing.
Yeah. Next name, Freddie Webster.
Amazing sound. He influenced a lot of people like Miles Davis. Just such a bright and full sound, not to be duplicated.
Yeah. And of course, the next name, Miles Davis.
Well, he had an amazing career that he could kind of shift directions, and he was always on the scene in New York. So and there was a reason for that. He just wasn't hanging out. He was checking out everybody who was playing, and you didn't see that many guys do that. So he was always on the scene, and he knew exactly who was next in line to call, and he knew where music was going because he was there scoping it out. So he had, besides his immense talent as a player and as a unique sound that only he could muster up, he was instrumental in just changing the face of music. Just a complete artist all around, great painter, just the art.
Yeah. And that's what I've heard about him, Randy. I've heard he's maybe the only musician who's changed the course of music like 5 times. Which
Yeah,
is
it was quite and you had to be on the scene to be able to do that. I mean, it was kind of common knowledge in a way that like after Herbie left that band, that probably Chick would or Keith would get, so he hired both of them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
He just knew what was going on, and other guys who weren't quite on the scene, maybe you didn't see around that much, but Miles was always on the hang.
Yeah.
Quite
Next
extraordinary.
Next name, Clifford Brown.
Well, I grew up with all those records from the early Art Blakey records at Live at Birdland. It was my dad's favorite player, and he had such a warm, the way he played ballads, just the warmth in his sound. Also coming out of Dizzy, as did Fats Navarro. I think Fats was a big influence on Clifford too, but there was just a warmth to his sound and his personality. He was unusual in the fact that he led a completely straight life. A lot of the other guys had, kind of personal problems that maybe contributed to the great music. I don't know, but Clifford's heart and soul just came out in everything he played.
Jimmy Heath has said on record that when Clifford was around, Miles did not play.
No, well,
Really. And there's a story. This is a true story. I don't. Are you familiar with the name Prophet Jennings? The story he told, what happened?
that's the name is familiar, but if you
Yeah,
repeat
there
it.
was there Clifford and Max Roach were playing in the club. It was supposedly raining, and they just lit the stage up, Randy. And supposedly Miles Davis walks in, borrows Clifford's trumpet, and Miles has his own mouthpiece, puts it in
Yeah.
Clifford's trumpet and plays a beautiful version of My Funny Valentine. And he says, I was there. He says, I witnessed it. He says, women were crying. He said, people were just mesmerized. Miles gives Clifford his trumpet back, takes his mouthpiece out, walks out and leaves. And that's supposedly a true story. The guy said he was there when that happened.
Wow, wow. Well,
So,
that took some nerve, but
yeah,
Miles could do that.
yeah,
I also saw him once, and that was a deep moment. Once again at the Village Gate, it was Dizzy's quintet and Miles's quintet.
mm,
And right at the right moment, I should remember what tune it was, but it was a ballad. Miles came out, and the light, he just appeared and played uh, with Dizzy. So that was an unforgettable moment. I should remember what tune it was, but that was also just fascinating.
next name, Lee Morgan.
Well, Lee and I had the same trumpet teacher, Tony Marcion from Philadelphia. Lee was about 7 or 8 years older, so I followed him early on, because he was also the talk of the young trumpet players in Philly,
Yeah,
and he had just another guy that just had a unique conception, the way he bent notes and the soulful element to his playing. It was just great. I'm one of his biggest fans, and there's a lot of Lee in the stuff that I do. At least I
yeah.
try to do.
Next name, Freddie Hubbard.
Well, like Lee, they did a lot of great records together, and he was also a major influence, particularly due to the fact that I was in Indianapolis or at IU for 3.5 years, and I caught a lot of the same stuff he had studied through studying with Dave Baker, a lot of the diminished exercises, and man, what he was just fantastic. What technique, and how much did he practice to get all that amazing technique together. And I was lucky enough to play with him uh, a couple times. We did a tour of Japan together with 2 trumpets and 3 saxophones, me, Freddie, Mike, Joe Henderson, and Joe Farrell. And so I got to play standing next to him, and just try to keep up with him was a force in itself.
Yeah. Next name, Charles Tolliver.
Well, Tolliver was on the scene just a couple years older, and he preceded me in Horace's band. Also a unique sound, his own conception, and a great composer. His big band is still really active, and they're just great charts. I'm a big fan of his too.
Yeah. Next name, Woody Shaw.
Well, what can you say? He shaped so many players after him. And in a way, he's kind of the last in that lineage, so to speak, to really create his own language. And we met in Seattle when he was playing with Horace's band and Joe Henderson. And I was out there, whatever summer that was, chasing after my first girlfriend. But that was amazing summer. Seattle was such a hip music town. It's where I met Coriel. There was a lot of music going on, man. I was only there maybe 2.5 months, but I started playing, working every night. And Horace was playing at a club called the Penthouse.
Yeah.
And before they would play on weekends, there were jam sessions, which I was usually a part of. The owner took a liking to me, Charlie Puzo.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd play before the name band came on, and Woody heard me, and I heard Woody, and we were the same age. He was only 6 months older than me. He was only 19. I was 19, and he was 19 and a half. I don't think he was even 20 yet. So we struck up a friendship, and he really helped me when I moved to New York shortly after. But he was fascinating to create your own. He had his own language at that age, and that's really unusual for a person who's that young to develop that vocabulary so early.
Yeah, yeah. And Randy, I got to add you to that list, man. You're part of that history I put you in that class. You're a fantastic musician. As I said, you've been on the scene for so many years. And like I said, your resume speaks for itself. You've worked with everyone, love your work, stuff that you've done, Brecker Brothers, your brother, and all these great artists that you've worked with. And I just want to say thank you for being on Jazz Talk today, man. You're a class act. Hope to see you soon. Maybe I live in the Maryland area, so I may have to fly to St. Louis to see you in August, my friend.
Okay, we'll check that out.
Maybe that's what I'll have to do. But hopefully you'll be back around here. And hang on, I'm about to close out the show.
Okay.
Well, you've heard it from the great Randy Brecker. And as the saying goes, if the music grooves and makes you move, it must be jazz. I'm Preston Williams with Jazz Talk signing off. Peace.